Hey guys, happy Sunday, fun day. You know what that means? It means a new episode of the Always Talking Crime podcast. I am Kimmy Thompson and I am your host. This is episode 7 already. I'm so excited. Guys, in the last week, I've been getting so many new followers, so many messages, so many interactions with listeners on Facebook and Instagram. And y'all don't even have any idea how much that means to me. Seriously, this is growing so fast. And we had listeners in Portugal, in Brazil, in Finland, in the UK. Where else? There was another one, a couple from Canada, I think. A lot of downloads from Canada. And interestingly enough, if you guys listen to the Luca Magnotta episode about the kitten killer, I think that was maybe my episode 4, if I remember correctly. I have listeners in Ontario, Canada, and isn't that where Luca Magnotta is currently serving his prison sentence? And I know he has access to the internet, so he's so narcissistic. I can completely see him searching for podcasts and information about himself online. So, Luca, if you are listening, you're still a fucking asshole. And just don't listen to my podcast anymore. I want listeners, but I do not want serial killers or murderers or kitten killers listening to my podcast. So show yourself the door. Anyways, I know there was another country, so I'm sorry if, I didn't mention the country, but there were so many new ones. I feel a little bit overwhelmed, but so happy. So if you guys could all click the follow button on whatever platform y'all are listening to this podcast on, I would so much appreciate it. And if that platform allows you to give me a 5-star review, that would be even more awesome, and I would appreciate it. I'm not sure. I know that on Spotify, you can now leave 5-star reviews. That's kind of a newish thing. I'm not on Apple Podcasts yet. I still have to jump through a few hoops, and I just haven't had the time, honestly, to do all the required steps in order to get on there. But that is on my list of things to do. I'm going to be giving you guys some extra episodes every month beginning in May. And May is Mother's Day, so I have a few doozy episodes coming up for you relating to mothers, either mothers that murder or mothers that were murdered. So stay tuned for that. But for today, I've got quite the story for you. You guys ready to jump in? Let's do it. All right, you guys. The murderer in today's episode has definitely had a lasting effect on American pop culture. The tale of his crimes most notably come from the widespread public attention in a few well-known films. It started with the Norman Bates character in the Alfred Hitchcock movie Psycho, followed by the Leatherface character in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as well as Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. They are all kick-ass movies. I'm sure if you're a true crime obsessed person like I am, you love those movies too. I've always loved scary movies and horror flicks since I was a little kid. I mean, I literally would beg my mom to let me watch them, and if she didn't, I would get my babysitters to let me watch them. So yeah, I was always obsessed as a kid. So I don't know what that says about me, but I'm not a serial killer, but don't push me. So anyways, this story that I'm going to talk about was also loosely adapted into other films, including the Rob Zombie films, House of a Thousand Corpses, and its sequel, The Devil's Rejects. Now, those movies are terrifying. And yeah, they're like disturbing and gross and disgusting, but so good. I've seen them numerous times, and it's cool because Rob Zombie's real life wife stars in the movie, so that's kind of cool. But Rob Zombie's awesome. I've always loved like White Zombie, the band, and then Rob Zombie's music when he started, going off just as a solo artist. But yeah, if you haven't seen those two movies, I would completely tell you to watch them whenever you're in the mood for a scary movie. Now, just a trigger warning here. Grave robbing and mutilation of corpses are both very heavy topics in this episode. It's going to just blow your mind. So just know that if you are extremely squeamish, there are probably parts. I'll try to tell you when you need to skip forward. But yeah, guys, it's super grisly. Okay. Now, I didn't know this until I started my research on this case, but back in the day, there were super sketchy people that would go out and rob graves, and they would sell the bodies to the medical professionals in the black market. I don't know why I'm so tongue-tied today. But these medical professionals would then perform experiments and do research on these corpses. So apparently there was a shortage of cadavers that were typically donated to science for this purpose. But it's super creepy as hell to think that scientists and doctors actually had to sink to the level of purchasing, stolen bodies on the black market, Another strange thing that happened involving grave robbing took place in Switzerland. That's where Charlie Chaplin's body was buried. Everybody knows who Charlie Chaplin is. But one night, his body was dug up by two guys, and they took his body and buried it out in a cornfield somewhere. The grave robbers then tried to get a ransom from Charlie's wife, but it didn't work. Instead, his wife contacted the police, and eventually they were able to get enough clues from the grave robbers to help locate the body and rebury Charlie Chaplin again at his original grave. But this time, his wife asked for his grave to be covered with cement so that this would never happen again. All right, guys, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to get really crazy. The criminal I'm going to talk about in this episode is the infamous Ed Gein. Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin on August 27th, 1906, and he was the second of two boys. Ed's older brother's name was Henry George Gein, and he was 5 years older than Ed. His parents were George and Augusta Gein, and they had an extremely unhappy marriage almost from the moment they married. Augusta was a very religious and domineering wife and mother, and she detested her husband. George was an alcoholic and unable to keep a job. He had worked at various times as a carpenter, tanner, and insurance salesman. So just a side note about Ed Gein's father, George. I'm not going to get too much into this, but in my research, I did find out that his upbringing was terrible. He was an orphan. He was orphaned at a very young age. I think it was 3 years old. His entire family was wiped out in some kind of, I think it was a flood or something, but at a very young age, he didn't have a family anymore. So, it probably explains why he became such a fucking trash father and piece of shit of a person in general. So, although Augusta despised George, their religious beliefs prevented them from even considering the possibility of divorce. It was reported that George was abusive, and he would often threaten Augusta that he would be unfaithful whenever they would argue. Nice guy, right? However, it was truly Augusta that wore the pants in the relationship and in the household in general. Augusta was a powerful character with a puritanical view of life based on her fanatical Christianity, and she dominated the entire family. She constantly drummed into her sons the innate immorality of the world and the dangers of alcohol and what she called loose women. She preached endlessly to her boys about the sins of lust and carnal desire and depicted all women, apart from herself, of course, as whores. In retrospect, it's thought that Augusta's strict view of life sowed the seeds of sexual confusion in adolescent Ed. His natural attraction towards girls clashed with his mother's warnings of eternal damnation. A naturally shy and slightly effeminate boy, Ed never dated girls, and he never had any healthy interaction with anyone of the opposite sex. So instead, he nurtured a completely bizarre devotion to his mother, like emphasis on bizarre. Augusta Gein was not only a mother, wife, and domestic rule maker, but also the family breadwinner. She ran a grocery store in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which was a growing metropolis on the banks of the upper Mississippi, halfway between Milwaukee and Minneapolis, which is cool because like I'm originally from the upper peninsula of Michigan, and like Green Bay, Wisconsin was like 3.5 hours away from my hometown, and I know where La Crosse is. Milwaukee was maybe 6 or 7 hours away from my hometown. And then, so, I mean, I know where all of this is on a map. I don't think I've ever literally been in La Crosse, but I might have gone through it before and never knew it, which is kind of cool. But anyways, in 1914, disgusted by the depravity of the town, she decided to move the family to a 195-acre farm deep in rural Wisconsin, where the family lived quietly for a quarter of a century. So they moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin. Augusta took advantage of this farm's isolation by turning away any and all outsiders who could have any sort of influence over her sons. Gein left the farm only to attend school. So, you know, Ed was like just stuck at home with his mom like all the time and very, very isolated. When he did go to school, he was frequently bullied by his classmates. He apparently had like this weird flap of skin on one of his eyelids that caused his eyes to droop. So the kids, of course, teased him relentlessly. He was shy, and classmates and teachers all remembered him as having strange mannerisms, like random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes he was telling himself inside his head. Augusta punished Ed whenever he did try to make friends. And despite this social isolation, he did fairly well at school, especially at reading. Outside of school, Ed spent almost all of his time doing chores on the farm. Meanwhile, the abuse from his mother, Augusta, escalated. So one example, guys, was when Augusta walked into the bathroom and caught Ed masturbating while he was taking a bath. She went completely fucking bonkers and poured scalding hot water on him as punishment. That seems like a very Christian-like thing to do, doesn't it? And very motherly and loving. On April 1st, 1940, Ed Gein's father, George, died of heart failure caused by his alcoholism at age 66. Henry and Ed had begun doing odd jobs around the town to help cover the living expenses. The brothers were generally considered reliable and honest by residents of the community. So while both worked as handymen, Ed also frequently babysat for neighbors. He loved babysitting, and he seemed to relate a lot more easily to children than he did adults. It wasn't long before Henry began dating a divorced mother of two. Can you just imagine what Augusta was thinking of that? And he was planning on moving in with this woman. Henry also came to reject his mother's view of the world, and he became worried about Ed's close attachment to her. And he often spoke ill about his mom in front of Ed. He always tried to warn Ed about how fucking creepy it was and like unnatural, and that Ed should like move out and like have a life of his own. This always upset Ed, who responded with disbelief, shock, and anger towards his brother. About 4 years after their father's death on May 16th, 1944, Henry and Ed were burning away marsh vegetation on the property. But the fire got out of control, drawing the attention of the local fire department. After the fire had been extinguished and the firefighters were gone, Ed reported that Henry was missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party went out and searched for Henry. And literally, Ed brought them directly to Henry's body. Like, he already knew where it was, which was totally sus. But Henry's dead body was found lying on the ground, face down. So apparently he had been dead for some time, and it appeared that the cause of death was heart failure, since he had not at all been burned by the fire. The police dismissed the possibility of foul play because they were obviously stupid or lazy, and the county coroner later officially listed asphyxiation as the cause of death. This was super weird, though, because there were obvious bruises found on Henry's head. Authorities just accepted the accident theory and no official investigation was conducted. So either they were like lazy or maybe they just didn't have the manpower, because like Plainfield, Wisconsin had like a population of 700, 800 at the most. Okay, so it's teeny tiny little community. An autopsy was not performed either. Years later, state investigator Joe Wilimowski, sorry if I just totally trashed your name, Joe, he brought up some questions about Henry's death. George W. Arndt, who studied the case, wrote that in retrospect, it was quote unquote possible and likely that Henry's death quite possibly had a quote unquote Cain and Abel aspect to it, which is not at all surprising since Augusta read from the Bible to both sons every single day throughout their upbringing. So, I mean, when you think about it, if Augusta was telling them the story about Cain and Abel, it could have possibly like given Ed Gein an idea on how to get rid of his brother when he got angry at his brother for like dissing their mom and their relationship. So who knows? It's never been proven that Ed killed his brother Henry, but it seems totally suspicious. After Henry's death, Ed and his mother were now alone, but Augusta had a paralyzing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Ed devoted himself to taking care of her. Sometime in 1945, as Ed later recounted, he and his mother visited a man named Smith who lived nearby to purchase some straw for their farm. According to Ed, Augusta had witnessed Smith beating a dog. I hate this part of the story. It's real quick though, okay? A woman inside the Smith home came outside and yelled at him to stop, but Smith beat the dog to death. Sorry, if you're an animal lover, you know I am too. Augusta was extremely upset by this entire scene, but it didn't bother her that Smith killed the dog at all. It was more the presence of the woman that upset her so much. Augusta told Ed that the woman was not married to Smith, so she had no business being there. Augusta angrily called her, quote unquote, Smith's harlot. She had a second stroke soon after, probably because she's like always up in everybody's business. She does not sound like a very nice or pleasant person to be around. But anyway, she had a second stroke and her health deteriorated rapidly afterwards. She ended up dying on December 29th, 1945 at the age of 67. So after Henry's death, Ed had about 18 months of alone time with his mommy before his mommy passed away. Ed, of course, was devastated by her death. And in the words of author Harold Schechter, he said, Ed had lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world. After that, Ed held on to the family farm, and he earned money from doing odd jobs. He actually boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs, the downstairs parlor, and the living room, leaving them untouched. While the rest of the house became increasingly dirty and just plain nasty, Augusta's room remained pristine. Ed lived in a small room next to the kitchen, and around this time, he started becoming interested in porn. And he started reading stories that involved cannibals and Nazi atrocities. Ed was a handyman and received a farm subsidy from the federal government starting in 1951. He occasionally worked for the local municipal road crew and crop threshing crews in the area. Now, sometime between 1946 and 1956, he also sold his brother Henry's farm, which was I guess it wasn't a farm, but it was a piece of land. It was 80 acres of land that Henry used to own while he was alive. Well, Ed went and sold it sometime, in that 10-year period. Although Ed was incredibly odd and acted completely creepy, nobody would have ever guessed in a million fucking years that soon after Augusta's death, Ed had begun to create a woman suit, basically so that he could become his mother. Like, Ed wanted to literally crawl into his mother's skin. Between the years of 1947 and 1952, Ed made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 different local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he said he was in a daze-like state. It was from the obituaries that Eddie would learn of the recent deaths of local women. Having never enjoyed the company of the opposite sex, he would quench his lust by visiting graves at night. I can't even imagine. So he was robbing fucking graves of women that had just died previously. Like, he would look through the obituaries and find them. And he especially would rob the graves of women that he thought resembled his mother. On about 30 of those visits, he said he came out of the daze while in the cemetery, and he left the grave in good order and returned home empty-handed. But on the other occasions, he actually dug up the graves of those recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother, and he took the bodies home, where then he tanned their skins to make various paraphernalia. And I will talk more in detail about that later. But it's fucking nasty as fuck. Nasty, nasty, nasty. For the record, Ed has always denied ever having sex with the bodies that he exhumed, explaining that they smelled too bad. Besides, Ed had promised his mother that he would remain a virgin. He did, however, take a particular pleasure in peeling their skin from their bodies and wearing it. He was curious to know what it was like to have breasts and a vagina, and he often dreamed of being a woman. He was fascinated with women because of the power and hold they had over men. So it's been reported that by wearing the women's skin, he would dance around outside on the farm, in this crazy, dazed out, freaky state, like he was on drugs or something, but like he wasn't on drugs. He was just mad. Like he was like insane, like crazy. And if you think about it, like nowadays, like when people are feeling like confused about their gender, or if they are born a man but they feel like a woman, like they have ways that they can transition. And like society is way more accepting of it now. But back then, during these years, like in the 50s, for one, it was frowned upon. And for two, you know, there was not really any way to change your sex. Like there wasn't like the sex change operations that people can go through now. So this is what he was resorting to. And it's been reported that he had actually put the women's body parts, like he would cut off the vulvas of these women when he was robbing their graves, or like sometimes he would just cut off the vulvas and the breasts or whatever he wanted and not take the entire body. But even if he had the whole entire body, he would cut off the vulvas and he would put them inside women's panties and like do like the tuck thing with his penis and like wear the panties so that like he felt like he was a woman. So and it gets grosser from here, guys. That's just like some of the things he did, but yeah. I just can't even imagine. Of course, Ed's crimes eventually evolved into targeting women who were still living because he had the hopes of preserving the skins for longer, you know, because if he killed them right away and then took the skin off, it wasn't already maybe decomposing inside a grave. I guess it makes sense, but it's so fucking gross. Ed acquired quite a collection of body parts, some which included preserved and shrunken heads. On one occasion, a young boy that he sometimes looked after, like he used to babysit, sometimes that kid would come over and visit Eddie's farm. Not in like a Michael Jackson way, I don't think, but this kid later said that Eddie had showed him human heads that he kept in his bedroom. Eddie claimed the shriveled heads were from the South Seas and they were relics from headhunters. When the young boy told people around town of his experience at Ed's house, his story was quickly dismissed as a figment of the young boy's imagination. Like, who's going to believe that, you know? I know I wouldn't. If somebody said that, I would not believe it. Somewhat later, the boy was vindicated, though, when two other young men paid a visit to Ed Gein's farm. They, too, had seen the preserved heads of women, but thought them to be just strange Halloween costumes. Rumors began to circulate, and soon most of the townspeople were gossiping about the strange objects Ed supposedly possessed. However, no one took the stories really seriously until Bernice Warden disappeared years later. In fact, people would often joke with Ed about having shrunken heads, and Ed would just smile and laugh or make jokes about having them in his room. No one thought he was telling the truth. Or possibly maybe they just didn't want to believe it was true. During the late 1940s and 1950s, Wisconsin police began to notice an increase in missing person cases. There were 4 cases that particularly baffled the police. The first was that of an 8-year-old girl named Georgia Weckler, who had disappeared coming home from school on May 1st, 1947. Hundreds of residents and police searched an area of 10 square miles of Jefferson, Wisconsin, hoping to find the young girl. Unfortunately, Georgia would never be seen or heard of again, which is super sad. There were no good suspects, and the only evidence police had to go on were tire marks found near the place where Georgia was last seen. The tire marks were that of a Ford. The case remained unsolved and wouldn't be opened again until years later when Gein was convicted of murder. Another girl disappeared 6 years later in La Crosse, Wisconsin. 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley had been babysitting at the time she had vanished. Evelyn's father repeatedly tried to phone the girl at the house where she was babysitting, and there was no answer. Worried, the girl's father immediately drove to where she was babysitting, but nobody answered the door. When he peered through a window, he could see just one of his daughter's shoes and her eyeglasses on the floor. He tried to enter the house, but all the doors and windows were locked, except for one, the back basement window. It was at that window where he discovered bloodstains. Terrified, he entered the house and discovered signs of a struggle, so he immediately called the police. When police arrived at the house, they found more evidence of a struggle, including bloodstains on the grass leading away from the house, a bloody handprint on the neighbor's house, footprints, and the girl's other shoe was left on the basement floor. I would be so terrified myself if, one of my daughters went missing like that and found all those things. A regional search was conducted, but Evelyn was nowhere to be found. A few days later, police discovered some bloody articles of clothing that belonged to Evelyn. It was near a highway outside of La Crosse. So the worst was suspected, but they never found her. In November of 1952, two men stopped for a drink at a bar in Plainfield, Wisconsin, before heading out to go deer hunting. Victor Travis and Ray Burgess spent several hours at the bar before leaving. The two men in their car were never to be seen again. A massive search was conducted, but there was never any trace of them. They had simply just vanished into thin air. So weird. In the winter of 1954, a Plainfield tavern keeper by the name of Mary Hogan also mysteriously disappeared. She disappeared from her place of business. Police suspected foul play when they discovered blood on the tavern floor that trailed into the parking lot. Police also discovered an empty bullet cartridge on the floor. Police could only speculate about what might have happened to Mary because, like the other four missing people, they had no bodies and very little useful evidence. The only other common tie among these cases was that all of the disappearances happened around or in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Then, on the morning of November 16th, 1957, Plainfield hardware store Bernice Warden disappeared. A Plainfield resident reported that the hardware store's truck had been driven out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. The hardware store saw few customers the entire day. Some area residents believed this was because of the deer hunting season. So, of course, all the guys, everybody was out deer hunting. And deer hunting is a huge thing up in my hometown in Upper Michigan. My parents both went deer hunting all the time. My ex-husband went deer hunting. I know my son went deer hunting with him. I mean, everybody goes deer hunting. Everybody goes out to hunting camp. And there's always they call them the hunter's widows. And then, of course, there's all these events at bars and taverns for the hunter's widows. So all the women would go out and have their girls' nights and stuff. So it was kind of fun. But everybody just assumed that all the guys were out hunting, and that's why the store didn't have very many customers that day. Bernice Warden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, which is cool that her son was a deputy sheriff, he entered the store around 5 p.m. to find the store's cash register had been opened and bloodstains were on the floor. Frank told investigators that on the evening before his mother's disappearance, Ed had been in the store and that he was to have returned the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. There was a sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze, a receipt that was written by his mom on the morning that she disappeared. She kept really good records and wrote out a receipt for every single customer. So that was the very last receipt that had been written. On the evening of the same day, the cops went in and arrested Ed. He was at a West Plainfield grocery store, and the Washora County Sheriff's Department went and searched the Gein farm. And this, guys, is where the major trigger warning is going to come into play, okay? Like, this is so gruesome and so terrifying that if you don't want to hear it, I would probably fast forward, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes, because I'm going to talk kind of extensively about what they found, okay? And if you're eating, you're probably going to want to stop eating right now if you haven't already, because this story has already been fucked up. The Washara County Sheriff's deputy discovered Worden's decapitated body in a shed on Gein's property. It was hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrists. Guys, her torso was dressed out like a deer. And for those of you who don't know what that means, this basically meant that she had been cut open from the pelvis to her sternum and all of her organs were removed. Just like the hunters do with their deers. They hang them upside down and slice them open and pull everything out, all the guts, all the organs, and it's just like an open cavity. So that's what Ed Gein did to her. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Thank God. Like, could you imagine, like, if it's bad enough that it happened at all, but ugh, imagine like that happening to you while you were still like semi-alive. But at least she had been shot first. I always have to try to find the bright side of everything, right? Anyways, guys, while searching the house, this is a list of the things that authorities found. Get ready. If you have a barf bag handy, I would grab it. They found whole human bones and fragments of bones. A wastebasket that was made of human skin. There were several chairs that had seats covered in human skin. There were skulls on his bedposts. He had female skulls, some with the top sawn off, which he made bowls out of. So he was eating from these bowls made from human skulls. They found a corset that was made from a female torso, skinned from shoulders to waist. This was actually what he would wear while he was dancing outside. So it did still have the breasts on it to make him feel like he was his mom or like a woman. They found leggings that were made from human leg skin. There were masks made from the skin of human heads. Mary Hogan's face mask was found in a paper bag. She was the one that had disappeared from the tavern. Remember, she had gone missing and nobody ever found her. Well, like Ed obviously got her. And like the face mask, guys, so it was her face with like empty eye sockets so he could put it on over his face. But he also scalped her. So like her hair, her scalp would cover his head, if that makes sense. It's so fucking disgusting. Mary Hogan's skull was in a box. Then Bernice Worden's head was found in a burlap sack. That was the chick that was hanging upside down, being treated like she was a dead deer carcass. Bernice's heart was found in a plastic bag in front of Ed's potbelly stove. So there was some kind of like, you know, rumor and gossip going around that Ed Gein was also like a cannibal, and nothing was ever proven about that. He never admitted to being a cannibal, so I don't know why the heart was right there in front of the stove. I kind of tend to think that he was planning on eating it, but he had not eaten it yet, because otherwise, why would you just have somebody's heart in front of the stove? You know, that kind of is obvious that he planned on eating it. 9 vulvas were found in a shoebox, and many of them had been decorated with like a silver glitter in hopes of like preserving them. Those were probably the ones that he put in the panties and would wear while dancing around. I know, guys, this is just like terrifying. I'm almost done, but not quite. They also found a young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old. And remember that one girl, I think her name was Evelyn, went missing. She was 15 years old. So I don't know if they ever found out if this vulva belonged to Evelyn, but I don't think that they had the means or the technology back then to be able to test things to find out who it belonged to. But it seems like pretty obvious that one of them had to have been from that girl that went missing. They found a belt made from female human nipples. They found 4 noses. They found a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring. Like, you know how you like pull down or raise the window shades? There was a pair of lips like decorating the end of the drawstring. They found a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. They found fingernails from female fingers. And they found gloves that he would wear that were made from human hands. Like, it's just, I can't even like imagine. And he didn't have electricity. So imagine the police having to go in. Everybody had to go in, the detectives and everything, investigate this house in the dark with like flashlights and lanterns and everything. And it must have just been like a fucking house of horrors, you know? I mean, I can't imagine finding it, you know, in the middle of the day with bright lights or if there was electricity. But like it must have been even more creepy in the dark. All of these artifacts were photographed at the state crime laboratory and then decently disposed of. When questioned, Ed admitted to stealing from 9 graves from local cemeteries and led investigators to their locations. The state crime laboratory participated in opening 3 test graves that were identified by Ed Gein. The caskets were inside wooden boxes. The top boards ran crossways, so not lengthwise. So it went across the opposite way. The tops of the boxes were about 2 feet below the surface in the sandy soil. Ed Gein had robbed the graves soon after the funerals while the graves were not completed. The test graves were exhumed because the authorities were really uncertain as to whether Ed Gein was like strong enough and capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during a single evening. Like, that seems like a lot of work, but they were found exactly as Ed had described. 2 of the exhumed graves were found empty, and one had a crowbar in place of the body. Most of the body was gone from the 3rd grave they exhumed. So Ed Gein's confession was largely corroborated by that. During questioning, Washara County Sheriff Art Schley, I think that's how you say it, reportedly assaulted Ed by banging his head and face into a brick wall. Ouch, but probably well-deserved. As a result, Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible, so he kind of fucked up the case. Shelley, I don't know how to say it. It's S-C-H-L-E-Y. Chalet, maybe? Chalet. We'll say Chalet. I don't know if that's it. Chalet died of heart failure at age 43, which is fucking young. But it was in 1968 before Ed's trial. Many who knew Chalet said that he had been traumatized by the horror of Ed Gein's crimes, and this, along with the fear of having to testify about it, and especially about having to testify about the assault that he did on Ed Gein, it caused his death. One of his friends had said he was a victim of Ed Gein as surely as if he had butchered him. On November 21st, 1957, Ed Gein was arraigned on one count of first-degree murder in Waushara County Court, where he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found mentally incompetent, thus unfit for trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which is now the Dodge Correctional Institution, which I believe is where that piece of shit Chris Watts is currently serving a life sentence. A maximum security facility in Wisconsin, in Waupun, Wisconsin, Waupun. I should know how to say that since I'm from up in that area, but is it Waupun? I don't know. Somebody from Wisconsin tell me. Message me and tell me how to say it. Or email me. Message me on Instagram, DM me, Always Talking Crime Podcast, or Always Talking Crime Podcast at Gmail. Tell me how to say it. Anyways, after he was there for a while, he was later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, doctors determined that Ed was mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his defense. So his trial began on November 7th, 1968, and lasted a total of 1 week. A psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Bernice Worden was intentional or accidental. Ed had told him that while he examined a gun in Worden's store, the gun went off, killing Worden. He testified that after trying to load a bullet into the rifle, it discharged. He said he had not aimed the rifle at her and did not remember anything else that happened that morning. At the request of the defense, Ed Gein's trial was held without a jury, with Judge Robert H. Gulmar presiding. Ed was found guilty by the judge on November 14th. A second trial dealt with his sanity. I mean, how could somebody be sane doing all these things? It's craziness. I don't know. I don't know. But after testimony, the doctors for the prosecution and defense, the judge ruled Ed Gein not guilty by reason of insanity, and the judge ordered him committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Ed spent the rest of his life in that mental hospital. Judge Gulmar wrote, "Due to prohibitive costs, Ed Gein was tried for only one murder, that of Mrs. Worden. He also admitted to killing Mary Hogan." Gein's house and 195-acre property were appraised at $4,700, which is equivalent to $42,000 in 2020. His possessions were scheduled to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958, amidst rumors that the house and the land it stood on might become a tourist attraction, which I'm sure, the people of that community, that small little town, were not going to be happy with having people coming into that town, creeping on the property, trying to, peep through windows and pay money to be able to go tour where all these horrific things had happened. And there are people that would do that. Literally, I'm one of those people. There are many, many attractions that are open. You can go, can't you just go stay the night at Lizzie Borden's house? There are things like that in haunted houses. I'm one of those freaks that literally would pay money to tour a place like that. So I don't know if you're one of those people too. If they had overnights there, I would totally stay the night. So something on my bucket list to do is start spending the nights in all these different houses that are supposedly haunted. But anyways, with Ed Gein being away from the farm now because he was in the mental hospital, the people of Plainfield were able to wreak their vengeance on his home, which had come to embody complete evil in their community. On the morning of March 20th, 1958, firefighters dashed to the Gein farmhouse, but were unable to save it from being just burned to the ground. Which had almost certainly had been started deliberately by the townspeople or somebody in town. When told about the fire, Ed Gein simply said, "It's just as well." Gein's 1949 Ford sedan, which he had used to haul all of the bodies of his victims from the, wherever he killed them or from the graveyards, that Ford sedan was sold at public auction for $760, which is equivalent to $6,800 now, to carnival sideshow operator Bunny Gibbons. Gibbons charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see it at the carnival. Now let's go back to talking about Ed. Ed was happy at the hospital. He was happier perhaps than he'd ever been in his life. He got along well with the other patients, though for the most part he kept to himself. He was eating 3 square meals a day, and he continued to be an avid reader. He liked his regular chats with the staff psychologist, and he enjoyed the handicraft work that he was assigned. He was doing stone polishing, rug making, and other forms of occupational therapy, although he did not get to do taxidermy on women's bodies anymore. He had even developed an interest in ham radios and had been permitted to use the money he had earned to order an inexpensive receiver. All in all, he was a perfectly docile patient, one of the few in the hospital who never required to be tranquilized to keep his craziness under control. Apart from some creepy moments like the weird as fuck way he would stare at nurses or any other female staff members who wandered into his line of vision, it was hard to tell that he was particularly crazy at all. Superintendent Sherbert told reporters that Ed Gein was a model patient, and he said that if all of our patients were like him, we'd have no trouble at all. Ed Gein died at the Mendota Mental Health Institute due to respiratory failure, secondary to lung cancer, on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. Over the years, souvenir seekers chipped pieces from his gravestone at Plainfield Cemetery, which is fucking weird. Why are you going to go take some kind of fucking souvenir from some crazy murderer's gravestone? I mean, God, people are assholes. Then finally, the whole gravestone itself was stolen in the year 2000. It was recovered in June 2001 near Seattle, Washington, and it was placed in storage at the Waushara County Sheriff's Department. So they just totally didn't put it back at his gravesite. The gravesite itself is now unmarked, but everybody knows where it's at. Ed Gein is buried between his parents and brother in that cemetery. So, guys, that wraps up the story of Ed Gein, which out of all of the story, I mean, he obviously seems a lot like Norman Bates in Psycho. I guess the Leatherface character from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, how he wears the faces, that was inspired by the story. And he seems a lot like Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, right? So, I mean, just fucking crazy and insane. And, yeah, it's totally bonkers to think that that actually fucking happened. So, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to eat anything today. I've totally lost my appetite. I may just get a cocktail. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. Remember to hit that follow button. Share this podcast with a friend, would you? I think I'm going to do some kind of cool drawing coming up soon on social media. It's going to be, I'm having something made, and I'm going to give it away as a prize. So once I have it in my hot little hands, I'm going to be posting about it on Instagram. And I don't have anything about this podcast on Facebook. I'm going to make a TikTok account because TikTok is a huge platform. Just haven't gotten there yet because there's only so many hours in the day, and I have a full-time job and all these other little side hustles going on. But like, I have like a huge passion for this. So if you could follow me, engage with me, tell your friends about this podcast, make sure you're following the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. Make sure you're rating it 5 stars if you have the ability to rate it. And if the platform allows you to give me a review, I would love to hear your thoughts, or just DM me your thoughts. Like, so many of you already have, and I know so many of you are already like chewing at the bit for this new episode because you've already gone through all 6 of them in this 1 week that you found my podcast. So thank you. Like, you don't know how much that I truly, truly appreciate your support. And I really look forward to continuing to build this community with you guys and just have more fun, I guess you can say, talking about true crime. I mean, I think it's fun. I think my boyfriend thinks I'm pretty psycho because, like, literally every day when I'm getting ready for work, I listen to a true crime podcast. I don't ever listen to my own because I don't want to hear my own voice. It's just weird. So I don't like to listen to me, but there are many, many other podcasts that I love. I particularly like lately Wicked and Grim. It's a married couple in Canada that you guys could listen to, like, when in between, like, waiting for new releases from me. They're pretty fun. They're a fun couple. I also listen to Murder with My Husband. Their episodes seem a little bit shorter. It seems like now that they've been doing this for a while, so their episodes are getting longer. But if you start with their earlier episodes, they're only like 30 minutes long, and I kind of like longer episodes. But their little banter back and forth is really cute too. So I like them. And I've also been listening to Morbid, which is super cool. Morbid actually has a girl that does like autopsies and stuff. So that's kind of cool. But they've been doing it for years. They've been doing this for years. And I'm just like, my podcast is a little baby podcast, still wearing like little newborn diapers. So help me grow it, okay? I love you guys. Make sure that you reach out at any time. And I'm going to let you go. I already have plans for the next like 3 episodes, and I'm so super excited. Like, I almost want to release them all at the same time, but I'm not going to. I'm going to make you wait. Have a great day, guys.